to do that, but many Muslim philosophers of the time were attempting to do that. And he was against that as well. And he published his very, very famous book, Tahafut al-Falasif, the incoherence of the philosophers, in which he was criticizing the falsafa tradition after he himself had mastered it. But not all Muslim scholars agree with that. And I really think that I will share with you some more on that, inshallah, a little bit later. But if there was one small shortcoming in the Imam's life, I would think it is this particular one. That he was so harsh on the falsafa tradition that all the falasifa had to go into hiding. They had to go underground. Because he made it so unpopular for anyone to become in the falsafa, to be involved in the falsafa tradition. So they all went in hiding, right? And the idea of thinking and ijtihad became an unpopular idea. The deen has been codified, the fiqh has been accepted, Ash'ari theology or Maturidi sometimes, and the Hanabila, of course, they had their own aqidah, so they had problems with Ash'aris and the Maturidis, right? But those are the established school of fiqh, those are the established schools of aqidah. That's it, we shouldn't address these issues. Let's shut down the door of ijtihad. It was one of the unforeseeable consequences of the Imam's decision to fight the falsafa tradition so vigorously. Ibn Rushd, for example, the great scholar of the Andalus, of Andalusia, he actually published a book in response to the Imam's book called Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence, right? Because he thought that the Imam Ghazali went too far in rejecting rationality and reason. But again, see, the Imam was struggling. He himself was struggling. He had grown tired with intellectualism. He was searching for something. He was tired of these ventures that have not provided him with the spiritual satisfaction he's looking for. So when he's publishing these things, it's all a reflection of the turmoil that was going through in his own heart. So it also needs to be understood in those terms. Another very important intellectual circumstance is tasawwuf, which was a huge movement of spirituality that was all around the Muslim world. And, I've never in the past spoken negatively about Sufis, except when I know 100% for sure that there are practices that go completely against the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. What is not disputed in his practices. Even though when we were young, the Shaykh of our masjid used to literally curse Sufis and stuff like that. I always felt there's something wrong with such categorization, with all the sweeping generalization. I've always felt there's something wrong with it. There are two issues that people might find with tasawwuf. One issue is deviating from orthodoxy or practicing acts of devotion that the Prophet ﷺ never practiced. And I would reject anything like that, because we cannot second guess the Prophet ﷺ and his spiritual path. We can never say that there is an act of worship that would please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the Prophet did not adopt. So we need to amend it and add it. This is my personal judgment. On the other hand, some people criticize tasawwuf over the centuries that it was pro-government. It supported the status quo, it supported leaders, it provided a vent for the masses to practice a very harmless form of religiosity, where it has nothing to do with governments. Let us just, be close to God and so forth. And interestingly, at the time when Turkey was fighting, Erdogan and all the Islamic parties in the 80s and the 90s, Sufi movements were on the rise. Syria, same exact thing. When Muslim Brotherhood were being banned, Sufi movements were giving full reign and support by the Assad government. But having said all that, generalization is always bad. If there are Sufis that practice a socially responsible and a socially cognizant form of spirituality, where people don't compromise their family, they don't go on long-term seclusion, they don't compromise the Sunnah, I honestly don't see anything wrong with it. Right? I still believe that the balanced Muslim has to have acquired the three prongs of knowledge: fiqh, theology, and spirituality. But to suggest that you can be a good Muslim without a little bit of spirituality is just as wrong. You just can't. You'll be missing out on some of the most flavorful and pleasurable things about what it is to be a Muslim. In fact, Imam Ghazali himself considers pure intellectualism to be a very efficient camouflage of ignorance. It's a very effective camouflage of ignorance. Knowledge that is stripped of spirituality is tantamount to ignorance. Right? That's what Imam Ghazali believes. So I just wanted to share with you some of my own personal thoughts. If tasawwuf is practiced with adherence to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and the mutawatir teachings and that sunnah, and if it is practiced with social responsibility, I think it is actually a beautiful thing. And you know, it is very important for that to be known publicly. So that covers some of the intellectual circumstances of his time. Areas of knowledge. Let me read this quote where Ghazali describes his own relationship with ilm and ta'allum. Quote, "In the bloom of my youth and the prime of my life, from the time I reached puberty before I was 20 until now when I am over 50, I have constantly been diving daringly into the depths of this profound sea and wading into its deep water like a bold man, not like a cautious coward. I would penetrate far into every murky mystery, pounce upon every problem, and dash into every mazy difficulty. I would scrutinize the creed of every sect and seek to lay bare the secrets of each faction's teachings with the aim of discriminating. Discriminating between the proponent of truth and the advocate of error, and between the faithful follower of tradition and the heterodox innovator. I would never take leave of an interiorist without wanting to learn about his interiorism, or of a literalist without wanting to know the substance of his literalism. The thirst for grasping the real meaning of things was indeed my habit and want from early years and in the prime of my life. It was an instinctive, natural disposition placed in my makeup by God Most High." That's how he describes himself. This is how he describes his relationship with knowledge. As Umar ibn Khattab used to say, إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمِ وَإِنَّمَا الْحِلْمُ بِالتَّحَلُّمِ. Ilm can only be acquired by trying to learn. And hilm, this compassionate and empathetic form of perseverance can only be acquired by trying it out. So we could comfortably say that the strongest area of knowledge that Imam Ghazali had was actually the pursuit of knowledge itself. He used to say such beautiful things. Take this for example. Every child, and I shared this I think at the school fundraiser a few weeks ago, every child has potential for both good and evil that exist in every child's heart. And it is only through nurture or neglection that the seed will reach its potential. If the seed of good is nurtured, it will grow into something beautiful. And if the seed of good is ignored, only evil can come out. He also said that the body needs to be cared for and sustained, and so does the heart. And the heart is nourished and sustained with Allah's mention, with education, with good morals and knowledge. He also believes that knowledge is not simply a memorized accumulation of facts, but rather a light which floods the heart, as I said earlier. And the Imam repeatedly keeps saying, so it is not necessarily the Harvard degree that will get you anywhere, although you still need to try to get to Harvard if you can. But it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seeing some goodness in your heart that He opens it up and pours His light inside. That's how knowledge becomes meaningful. Otherwise it's just dry. Some of the most knowledgeable people in this world are really, really evil. Or, to say the least, just simply useless. Completely socially irresponsible. have broken families. What good is it all? If it is not inspired by the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, it is ma'rifah. That's what He is after. Know your Lord. Know the object of your love. Let me share with you some of His advice to students. I will not mention all of it, but I'll give you just some examples, snapshots. First, you've got to purify your soul. He's talking to the students. The student must remove himself or herself from the ties of this world. Student of any knowledge, focus on what you're doing. Which means that you need to create a learning environment that is void of the iPads and the computers and the Blackberries and all these things that just act as a distraction. The student must not see himself or herself as above the teacher. Understandably. Ignore the contradictory opinions of others, and not because they are wrong, but because you need to strengthen the foundations of your own knowledge before you tackle the contradictory opinions. Do not attempt to study everything at once. So if you're working on a master's degree in biochemistry and you love Islamic studies so much, finish that first. And then go pursue something else if you'd like, but do one thing at a time. However, he balances the statement when he says, the student must become familiar with the nature and scope of all branches of knowledge. Again, the student must become familiar with the nature and scope of all branches of knowledge. Isn't that what I've been saying on this pulpit for months? I have been telling you the key to scholarly success and truly understanding this world and your place in it and your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to know a little bit. Again, he says scope and nature. When we say something like dermatology, how many people in this room know what dermatology is? Okay? When we start having a conversation about any branch of knowledge, I need to know what that branch is and its scope. Just a little bit of basic information about it. He's not saying you got to know everything about it, just enough to sustain a reasonable conversation. Dermatology is the medical field that studies the diseases of the skin. And so, when we say, what is this branch of knowledge, what does that know? I'm a mathematician, I teach math at public school, I don't know anything about anything else. You talk to them about politics, about economics, you talk to them about history, you talk to them about fiqh. You know, like most Muslims, I love it when they do that. You know, I don't have any knowledge about Islam. I don't claim to be a scholar. Are you proud? You know, that you don't have any knowledge about Islam? You should have enough information, a little bit of information about most branches of knowledge, but you take one that becomes your field, that becomes your specialty. Right? The student must know how to judge the noble nature of science. The student is to have a clear idea of the relation of the different sciences to the goal of learning, interdisciplinary understanding of the fields of knowledge. He also talks to teachers, and he says the teacher should be sympathetic to the students and treat them as their children. Teachers should follow the example of the Prophet ﷺ and teach for free. May or may not agree with the Imam. The teacher is obliged to ensure that each student works at the correct level for himself or herself. Remember Finland? The teacher's job is to ensure that the kids are at their own levels. You know, we're not pushing them, right? We walk at their own pace. Teachers must not say anything derogatory about sciences other than those he is teaching. So if you're teaching kids chemistry, you want to curse chemistry, that's fine. But don't say derogatory things about physics or about the social sciences, which is also something that happens a lot today. The teacher must ensure that the materials he's provided for the students and the tests are not too difficult. Student success is important for students to enjoy learning experience. Wallahi, if I didn't say it was Gazali and I said that was quoted from a modern scholar of education, was a PhD from Harvard, would you have believed me or not? The same thing. For those students who are struggling, the teacher should reach should teach them only that which is suitable for their learning level. The teacher must practice and live what he knows and teaches, and not allow his behavior to contradict his words. Right? Gems the Imam shared with us. But then to talk about specifics in terms of areas of knowledge, the Imam learned the Quran and memorized it at a very, very young age. He learned Arabic, grammar and poetry, and balagha, and badi' and so forth. He studied hadith with really great scholars in hadith sciences. And he also studied fiqh. He was a jurist, so obviously it was one of the branches of knowledge. He also studied theology and aqidah. He was Ash'ari, but by the way, he deviated from Ash'ari theology every once in a while. And one of the things that Ash'aris hold so dear is the notion that people who are not Muslim will not necessarily be saved on the Day of Judgment. The Imam had a different view. He deviated from that, and there's a lot of detail that there's no time to mention for the purposes of this lecture. He also studied philosophy, and as I said before, he wrote Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosopher, and was kind of responded to or refuted by Ibn Rushd, the incoherence of the incoherence. He studied Tasawwuf and definitely Shafi'i fiqh as well. Methodology and jurisprudence. When Imam Abu Hamid Ghazali is mentioned, we always think of him in different lights depending on the approach. Some people think of him as a philosopher. Some people think of him as a Sufi master. But in essence, what Imam Ghazali was is a faqih. He was a jurist. And the only reason he did not develop his own madhab in fiqh, so to speak, is that he was so loyal to the teachings of Imam Shafi'i. He loved him. After the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr, he considered Imam Shafi'i to be the greatest man that ever walked the earth. He loved him to that extent. He was not prepared to deviate from Shafi'i fiqh, even though he actually used kalam polemics, he used falsafa arguments in order to work his way into fiqh. And he created an incredible methodology that could have constituted a different madhab, perhaps close to Shafi'i fiqh, but a little bit different as well, but he wouldn't do that. And it's hard, I think, for us, modern day Muslims and even Westerners, to think of Imam Abu Hamid Ghazali as a faqih. It's the aspect of his life that is not often mentioned, but that is what he was. Even when he was in Khurasan, and he had two really great teachers, Al-Farmadi and Imam Al-Juwayni, because Al-Farmadi was more on the tasawwuf side of things, and Imam Al-Juwayni was more of a faqih, he actually spent more of his time, or most of his time with Juwayni. I will talk about this, inshallah, in the teachers section. While at Nizamiyya, he wrote an incredible book that was titled Instructions to Legal Principles. And interestingly, the very last book the Imam wrote in his life was Al-Mustasfa fi Usul al-Fiqh, right? Which is basically the cream of the crop in all fiqh principles, the best of the best. After all of his tasawwuf journey, he still writes a book of fiqh at the very end of his life. Let me actually say something here that the Imam used to say. He used to argue that that intellect must be assisted by the revealed truth. That mere utter intellect that is not bound by any principle, that is not bound by morality or regulated by the divine, can actually be harmful and could be counterproductive. So it needs to be guided by the revealed truth, wahi. Now we talk about teachers, inshallah. So the earliest teacher is obviously all of those people that his father appointed, and that neighbor that acted as the custodian that took care of the entire process. But his very first formal teacher is Ahmed al-Razkani. In English, I think it sounds like Radkani, but it is what it is. He was an Imam of fiqh, but he was also involved in tasawwuf. And then the Imam moved from Tus to Jurjan in order to study at the madrasa, where he learned with another Imam, Abu Nasr Ismaili. We don't talk about him a lot. He's not mentioned a lot in the books of history. But it was his significant move to Nishabur, where he met Imam al-Haramain, Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwayn, who was possibly one of the most incredible fuqaha of his time. And Imam al-Juwayni again was Ash'ari and Shafi'i, and he was loved by the Seljuks, and he had already been appointed by Nizam al-Mulk to be one of the greatest teachers of the Nizamiyya school. Imam Abu al-Ma'ali Abdul Malik ibn Abdullah al-Juwayni, also known as Imam al-Haramain. He had a great theological collection of works that was called Al-Irshad. And I think that the Imam al-Juwayni introduced Ghazali to the idea of using kalam and falsafa arguments to expound fiqhi opinions, which again was never done before. Juwayni used to say about his student Al-Ghazali is a sea to drown in. The teacher says that about his own student. And then the Imam Al-Ghazali worked with another teacher, Al-Fadl ibn Muhammad al-Farmadi, as I said earlier. And he died about 6 years after the Imam started learning with him. But Al-Farmadi was more involved in mysticism and tasawwuf, so he had possibly less of an impact than Al-Juwayni had on the Imam. Now, if we were to talk about students, in most English sources, it is not necessarily clear who were the greatest students. I mean, there are references, but not detailed references. But in Arabic sources, there's plenty of information on that. And I think that it is not an exaggeration to say that one of the greatest students of the Imam, I think you got to understand, Imam Ghazali, with this scope, with this magnitude of ilm and knowledge, with this charisma, with this presence, he eclipsed everything else around him. I mean, we hardly know anything about his family. We don't know his mother's name. We hardly know little information about his own kids. We certainly know very little about his students. He eclipsed them all. They were all basically dwarfed around the Imam. But one great student of the Imam is Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the great Maliki scholar of Ashbiliyah, Sevilla of Spain, also known as Al-Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi. Not to be confused with Muhyi al-Din al-Arabi, who was Muhyi al-Din ibn Arabi, who was another scholar of Tasawwuf. And by the way, I think one of the very particular things that cause a lot of people in this country to be critical of Zaytuna Institute is that Sheikh Hamza, whenever he talks about Ibn al-Arabi, people think he talks about Ibn Arabi. And Ibn Arabi was not necessarily a liked figure, at least by the Hanbali side of orthodoxy. Al-Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, even though he was Maliki, but he was exposed to the teachings of Imam Ghazali on one of his trips to Iraq, and he stayed there for a while. It is also suggested, and we don't know that 100% for sure, but there is strong evidence that suggests that Abdul Qadir al-Jilani himself was a direct student of Abu Hamid Ghazali, from the sources that we have studied. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, obviously, they attribute the Qadiriyya tariqa to his teachings and so forth. And then there's Abdul Ghaffar al-Farisi, who wrote one of the biographies on Imam Abu Hamid Ghazali. Those are a few names that we know of. And we have one more section left, inshallah, and that is the summation of life. And as I said earlier, the last turning point in the Imam's life, when he came to a realization that it is balance between the body, the mind, and the soul that can produce a human being that that will attain the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he basically went back. They say went back to orthodoxy, but I would not want to characterize it that way. He returned to Tus, and then he opened again a school. He secluded himself from public eye for over a decade, but when he came to that realization, he went back home and he started a school, and he started the halaqah and a spiritual training center and so forth, directly engaging people, not following the stereotype we have in our minds about Sufis hiding somewhere in the masjid in the basement, worshipping Allah. He wasn't doing that. He was directly engaging people and helping them out. His brother, Ahmad al-Ghazali, describes the very last day of the Imam's life. Because after spending about 2 years in the public eye, he started to feel that he's ailing and he's getting frail and that his moment has come. So that's why he basically quit his job and went back to his place and secluded himself for a few months. And on that fateful day, Ahmad Ghazali says, it was Monday the 18th of December 1111, the year 1111. My brother Abu Hamid Muhammad, by the way, in the English translation, it states the date in Gregorian terms, but in the Arabic sources it actually says it in Hijri too. So the 18th of December 1111, my brother Muhammad awoke. At dawn he performed his prayers. He prepared himself for his death. He asked me to bring his burial shrouds, and I did. And in one of the narrations, and I translate this from Arabic, he kissed his shrouds, and he laid on his back in the direction of the Qibla, and basically said the saying that I told you earlier, that I used to ask Allah for ilm, and I wish I had spent more time asking Him for taqwa. And then he said, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, closed his eyes, and then passed away. And that concludes, at least for the purposes of this lecture, it concludes our discussion on Imam Abu Hamid Muhammad Ghazali, Hujjatul Islam. And I wanted, inshallah ta'ala, before I let you guys go, or have you ask me questions before we pray Isha, inshallah, I wanted to just, provide you and myself with a closure to this series that, as I said, I personally benefited from more than anyone. We had a pronounced or a declared objective that we had in mind, at least my team. We all agreed on an objective, and that is to bring to light the legacy and the works, the incredible impact that those great people had in the life of our ummah, and how we can benefit today from that legacy. Nonetheless, it could be argued that I, and only me, had an ulterior motive. One that was not shared with my team. One that is just as important as the stated goal. And that is to shatter idols we create and to destroy boundaries we put between us that only divide us as Muslims. The labels, that is what is bringing this ummah to its knees. The labeling process. I intentionally wanted to cover in this series lots of information about Sunni Islam by talking about its scholars and their legacies. Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. I wanted to cover as well the Shia side of things, and I brought to light from Sunni eyes, I brought to light the works and the tremendous legacy of revered imams and figures on the Shia side of this divide, such as Imam Hussein and Imam Ja'far ibn Muhammad as-Sadiq radiallahu anhu. Labels. I wanted to shed light on Aqidah issues. That's why I dedicated quite a bit of time talking about Mu'tazili thought in the Imam Ahmad lecture, and today I talked about the Ash'aris and so forth. And finally, in this lecture, I think we've achieved to also address tasawwuf, which is the other aspect that divides the ummah. So we have divisions on the fiqh side of things, divisions on the aqidah and creed side of things, and divisions with regard to the tasawwuf and the spirituality side of things. Why did I want to do that? For two purposes, and I end the lecture with this. One of them is وَإِنَّ هَذِهِ أُمَّتُكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً. This ummah of yours is one. وَأَنَا رَبُّكُمْ فَاعْبُدُونِ. And I am your Lord. I am also one. And I am your Lord, and I expect you to worship me. Our ummah is one. We might have our differences and labels, but this is one ummah as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described it. The second purpose is هُوَ سَمَّاكُمُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. As Allah says in the Quran. It is Allah who called us Muslimin. He did not say you're Sunni or Shi'i or you're Maliki or you're Hanbali or Shafi'i or Ash'ari or Sufi. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called us Muslims. And at the end, there is a huge, huge territory of agreement that brings us all together. And sometimes I don't understand why we ignore that and focus on the small things that only sets us apart. That's what I try to achieve, and with the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the hard work of our team members, and with the dedication of this incredible group of people that have been coming consistently, I can now comfortably say that the Pioneering Imams series has come to an end. Jazakumullah khairan for making this a great success, and please always remember us in your dua. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So let us take some questions, shall before we go for Isha. Yes.
You mentioned about Nizamul Mulk being killed by on a journey to Makkah.
He was going for Hajj.
Okay.
He was going for Hajj, and some Batani Hashashin were lurking in the dark waiting for him. And then they assassinated him. In fact, historians say that at the attempt by the Fatimids to assassinate a great loved leader of the Seljuks was actually a sign of decay and destruction. It's like a man who's falling who takes a final swing and then falls right after it. It's precisely what happened. And there's something that I didn't mention in the course of the khutbah that pertains directly to what you said. The Fatimids were replaced by the Ayyubis. Remember? Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, who came and removed the wazirs of the Fatimids in Egypt and established the Ayyubi dynasty with one premise, and that is to fight the Crusades. They had already taken Jerusalem about 100 years earlier, right? Now it's the time to take it back. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi is the nephew of Nuruddin Mahmud. Remember? That's Nuruddin. Nuruddin and so many of the leaders of the Renaissance of the Ummah at the time were all graduates of the Nizamiya school system. You understand? So many great scholars in the fields of knowledge, the arts, fiqh, aqidah, sciences, physics, chemistry, that led the Ummah in its push against the Crusades that liberated Jerusalem, were not just a bunch of people making dua at the masajid. They had reached the height of knowledge, and they were all graduates of the Nizamiya school system, including Salah ad-Din's uncle himself. So the assassination of Nizam al-Mulk was really just, sort of like a desperate attempt to stop what is perceived as peace and prosperity on that side of the Muslim world. I will take this. The brother raised his hand.
Thank you very much. It was very good lectures, and really lots of benefit. Now, if we look at those scholars we have taken, and how much they have suffered, and how much they were tortured by what we call them Amir al-Mu'mineen. And those Amir al-Mu'mineen, they were very close to the beginning of Islam, not very far away. Now, how would you think nowadays, with the situation the way it is in the Muslim countries, can we establish and get back to our origin? I am sorry to say it, I am very pessimistic.
Well, that's obviously a tough question. I don't think that I can give it justice in just a couple of minutes, but I need to say that the history that we read and everything that I presented here, this is not the history of Islam. It's the history of a flawed human society that was called the Muslims. We should not conflate the two. This is not the history of the deen. The deen is free from error. It's how people practice it and the choices they make that will get history rewritten. We should not cast shades of doubt on the validity of the deen. Nobody's trying to do this. But we shouldn't succumb, at least, to such attempts because of the history of Muslims. Right? Because that is the history of a given human society. Some were good, some were bad. Even at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there were great Muslims and great worshippers. But if I asked you to name all the great Sahaba that you've ever studied, you'd probably come up with like 50 names. I mean, we squeeze it so hard. 125,000 Sahabis were standing there when the Prophet was giving the farewell sermon. Who are those people? What did he do? How good were they? Some of them stole, some of them committed fornication, some of them did this, and some of them did really terrible things. Because it was a human society. And what makes human society successful is obviously their relationship with Allah. That's part of it, but it's also everything else. It is the advancements of science, it is open-mindedness, it is using reason and using rationality, it is education, it is freedom and democracy. See, I see that the source of all evil in the Muslim world is dhulm.
Yes.
Dhulm is the source of evil. It's injustice. You remove dhulm, I think, inshallah ta'ala, things will get better. إِنِّي حَرَّمْتُ الظُّلْمَ عَلَى نَفْسِي وَجَعَلْتُهُ مُحَرَّمًا بَيْنَكُمْ فَلَا تَظَالَمُوا. I prohibited myself from practicing it, and I made it prohibited for you. And you should not practice injustice and do aggression against each other. It is a battle of justice. You remove injustice, I think the Muslim world will get better. It'll just take a few years. So unlike you, I'm actually very, very optimistic, alhamdulillah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not allow al-ummah shahida to suffer in the chains and the shackles of injustice and tyranny for long. Because you know what that does? It strips us from our mission. Our mission is to witness, to testify with regard to the affairs of ourselves and the other ummah, of the other nations. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us suffer for centuries and drown in injustice. He wouldn't allow that. And I think the Arab Spring is a way by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding us that there's still some good in this world. What the people of Syria are doing is remind us that there's still men in the ummah. There are still true men in this ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam who gladly give their lives for what they think is true and righteous. 12 months ago, we could have never made a similar argument. We could have never even imagined that that is possible. I am actually quite optimistic. I'd give it, inshallah, 10, 15 years, and I promise you, I might be standing on this pulpit or another one somewhere else. And we will address this issue, and I will remind you of that. May Allah give you a long life. There was, yes.
My question was, would you consider the work of Imam Ghazali, Ihya Ulumuddin, to be structured qualitatively?
Well, some Western scholars say if all the books of Islam are lost except the Quran and Ihya Ulumuddin, we still have enough material to start. Some of the Orientalists actually say that. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration. Ihya Ulumuddin is unique because it addresses, how many of you read the Ihya, by the way? It's an amazing reading. I really advise you to read the book. It's huge. It'll take you months. But go through the book. It talks about fiqh. And it actually points out the beauty of fiqh. Not just the rules, right? But connects fiqh with spirituality. They say Imam Abu Hamid was a jurist in the cloak of a Sufi, right? So even when he talks about fiqh, there is like overflowing beauty that is coming from the expounding of fiqh arguments. And then he talks about spirituality. He talks about the end of life. He talks about the day of judgment, heaven and hell. He talks about matters of philosophy and kalam. It's an amazing work, right? I'm not sure. I did not read all of the Imam's works, not even half of them. But I think it certainly is one of the greatest works that was ever authored in Muslim history. Was it his greatest work or not? I think that's arguable. Allahu A'lam. It could very well be. Yes.
Yeah, my question regarding Sufi, the things that I see they are unique in their activities is they are doing something like exaggerating in the religion. The unique thing is they are never conflict with the government. So they are always away from this conflict. Is there anything else like distinguish them from Sunnah and Jama'ah?
Did you guys hear what the brother was saying?
Could you repeat, please?
He says that the main thing about Sufis that he sees is that they are always, they're not having any problem with governments in general. Again, I don't think that statement in and of itself is historically 100% true. Because we have seen Sufi movements in Southeast Asia, in North Africa, that have actually led struggle against occupation and foreign intervention and so forth. Umar al-Mukhtar of Libya himself was a teacher in the Sufi tariqah. So that did not prevent them from having that social responsibility. And that's what I said. You want to focus on spiritual matters, fine, as long as you're not forgetting about the other aspects of your life. You're not allowing yourself to be used by those who are in power to suppress other people in your society, which was also done by Sufis. And in fact, some of the greatest opponents of Erdogan in Turkey were the Sufi tariqas of Turkey, ironically. And some of the greatest support he received was from secular groups. So politics has its own interesting way of unfolding. Yes?
The actual methodology that Imam Ghazali used when he went in his 10 years into Khalwa or Uzla, what did he actually do? Because we talk theoretically, but the practice, because that's what made him achieve ma'rifah or gnosis. And we can replicate that because that's what he left for us behind as a legacy.
I'm sorry to burst your bubble, and I know you and I wish we knew in detail the exact steps he took, but he did not tell us. He did not mention it. In fact, the parts in his book, in his autobiography, that address this journey are actually quite brief. He grazes over and he says, I went to this place and I went to that country and I spent a couple of years here, quoting a couple of stories here and there, but he doesn't tell us in detail what he did. He didn't. But if I have to guess, just putting the pieces together from what he talked about in his books or his work and his legacy, I would say that he isolated himself from outside factors and focused internally. He just focused on what's inside. Most of us, when you have a problem, when you have chest pain, you go to a doctor. When you have a fiqh question, you go to the imam. When you need some money, you go to the banker. When you have an issue with government, you organize a protest or send a letter to the editor. It is always about outside forces expecting an outside audience. right? That is the outward side of knowledge is. But I think that the Imam spent those 10 years, I mean, I don't know what he did, but I think that he spent those 10 years focusing on the inside. Who am I? What am I doing? My heart, my connection with Allah. And doing what Umar ibn Khattab did. He would do Salatul Qiyam every night for 20 years until it finally worked. After 20 years, he started feeling the pleasure of Qiyam. Stay at it. Every single day, work as hard as possible. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will open your heart and send that light into it. But I wish I knew, as you said, more detail about the specifics of what he did. Brother?
Because there is an opinion that Imam Ghazali gave such prestige to Sufism that later on it was possible for Ibn Arabi and Jalaluddin Rumi to openly preach their Sufism. Otherwise, they could have had the same situation as Hallaj had or some other Sufis had with the ulamas, and they got troubled and the kings took action against them. So is that true that Imam Ghazali gave such a practice that the ulamas could not do harm to the Sufis?
Yes, the answer is yes. This is a very good question. The answer is yes, and that is simply because when you bring something that has a negative reputation and associate it with someone who has a really positive reputation, what is bound to happen? One of two things. It's either that thing that has a negative reputation will acquire a positive reputation by association with a really good person, or that the person himself will lose the positive reputation and acquire a negative reputation by simple association. Now, it didn't matter at the time of Imam Ghazali, and because he had already established his credibility as a faqih, and because he was loved by the political establishment, so there were no political issues involved, anything, if you associated with Ghazali, would look beautiful. Right? In addition to that, the brand of tasawwuf that Ghazali practiced was compatible with what I described earlier. It was socially responsible, it was adherent to the sunnah, and it was acceptable by most people, and that is how the idea of tasawwuf started gaining prominence. Now, it is the idea of orthodox mainstream tasawwuf that gained prominence, but when it became accepted, it opened the door for other practices of tasawwuf that, some might consider to be unbecoming or unorthodox. Well, 2 more questions? Yes.
As a student, you shouldn't attempt to study everything at once, and then also to familiarize yourself with the nature and scope of all areas of knowledge. So how can, in what ways can we familiarize ourselves with the nature and scope of all areas, and then at the same time not study everything at once?
Okay, good question. Do you guys hear the question? So how can we, as the Imam says, how can we familiarize ourselves with the scope of all different kinds of knowledge, while at the same time not studying them all at the same time? And again, what I have been recommending throughout the lecture series is for us to have basic information about all kinds of knowledge. And actually, if you go to any community college, they always have general ed classes, right? You always have like the English 101. You have the philosophy 101. You have the physics 101. You have the math 101, and so forth. And I remember going through my undergrad, I took like pretty crazy classes that had absolutely nothing to do with what I'm doing today or what I did before, right? But I enjoyed them. It helped me make a decision about what I wanted to be. It helped me, decide what is exciting and what is not exciting. But I think most importantly, it exposed me to think in a more coherent and a more comprehensive way about matters that are thrown our way. Teenagers, they always complain, why do I have to study the history of the Roman Empire? Right? I don't want to be a historian, I want to be a doctor. Right? But it is not the big title that you're learning or benefiting from. Yes, the history of Rome, and the demise of Rome, and Julius Caesar, and the transition into from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire and all this stuff. Who cares about that? But it's actually the subtle, small details. They are ingrained in your mind. They help you think. They help you develop a methodology by which you can judge things in a more comprehensive way, accepting the existence of other factors and the relevance of those factors as well, so you factor them in any decision you make. So, to put it quite simply, I would say read as much as possible. Make sure that you have a simple book, either a textbook or just a simple description. Like for instance, those of you who would like to know about political philosophies, if you have never read The Prince, for instance, who authored that, by the way? Machiavelli, right? If you've never read The Prince, if you've never been exposed to the works of Edmund Burke, if you don't know what conservatism is, if you don't know what John Locke talked about, or Thomas Jefferson, or any of these political philosophies that we know of, there is a book actually, and I have it in my library, that talks about 50 of the most influential philosophers in the history of man, all the way from Plato and Aristotle to Martha Nussbaum of the University of Chicago. Just 2 pages on each philosophy will give you the digest of everything. So when we talk about fascism, and you think it's a sandwich, then there's a problem. You see what I'm saying? At least when we talk about fascism, you have some understanding and sustain a conversation. You don't need to take a class, but you need to have a book, and I say book, by the way, not a Facebook page. Not something on the computer, a physical book that you can read at home. So ensure that, inshallah, over the next 3 or 4 years, make it your target to read as much about those other knowledge fields as possible, and still focus on what you're doing at school or at work, or whatever it is, inshallah. Yes?
What is the effect of Ghazali on the later scholars like the Maliki, Muhammad Abdu, and Muhammad Abdul Wahab? Nowadays?
Those came about 1,000 years after the Imam, so I'm not, maybe there's a study somewhere that particularly addresses that, but honestly, I can't necessarily tell. Imam Abu Hamid Ghazali had an impact on all of us, one way or another, and on our teachers as well. But to trace it in a scholarly manner, I don't think there is a particular study out there that addressed that particular question, so I would just say I don't know. Yes?
Did you come and research, did you come across why the Imam made a statement, I wish I asked enough for fatwa?
No, I mean, anyone's judgment is as good as yours and mine. It will be just a third party's perspective on why he said that. But I think just studying his life, when you are on your deathbed, the way you spend your days really matters. And that's the greatest question that comes to me. I spent 30 years working on this job. I spent 25 years in this venture. I helped with this. I worked with that. Significant chunks of our existence were expended in ventures. We thought at the time they were the right thing. That idea hits us so hard at the time of our death. Was it worth it? Was it the right thing? Was there something else I should have invested my time in? Was that the best thing? All this knowledge and all the books I authored, I mean, again, from if you'd like to crunch some numbers and just mere math and calculations, oh, the Imam authored all these books and he got a lot of hasanat, inshallah he's going to go to Jannah. I don't think that that's what the Imam was after. He was after something that is much greater than just Jannah, just a place. Might have some beautiful things, but it's just another dominion, it's another realm. What is more important is the Lord of that Jannah, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He wasn't questioning his existence and his life. No, he was questioning whether or not he made the right choice in terms of the venture he took that would bring him as close to Allah as possible. And I can't imagine what kind of ideas would be crossing through my head when that day comes. Was it the right thing to spend so much time as the Imam giving lectures and counseling families while you are compromising your own relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of how tense the job is? I mean, I'm pretty sure that question will come to me one day. Was it better for me to be an employee somewhere or to just practice medicine and be done with it and go home at some point, spend some more time with the kid? What is more valuable? To be giving a lecture at Salam or spending time with my family? I don't know. I'm here tonight because I think this is more important. But maybe on my deathbed, I will think otherwise. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. And I ask Allah, while we're still alive and there's a breath of air in our chests, that we will be guided to make the best decision and the best choice that fits the time that we are given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
You have done an outstanding job. I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I attended all the presentations. I had to miss one because I am so may God bless you and your family. Give you a lot of prayers and blessings. I just have a question about the DVDs. When they might be available and where?
Alhamdulillah, Sister Nahid and Paul have done a tremendous job making them available. So we do have almost all of them, I think, except for tonight's lecture. So I think Sister Nushin and I and the rest of our team will find a way to inform you once those DVDs are available and give you a chance to order them, and inshallah we will ship them to you. But I also would still make possibly a lesser resolution copy available on YouTube for those who just want to watch it. So if you don't want to pay for it, it'll just be the cost of the DVDs really. But if you don't want to pay for it, inshallah we'll make a lower resolution copy available online, inshallah, as well. I can take one last question. If anyone
right now, the DVD right now is available for sale?
I mean, not for sale. I mean, we have them, but we need to make copies of them
No,
too.
the lecture before tonight.
We do have all the DVDs, but we have not duplicated them.
Oh.
Yes.
Just to clarify, you mentioned that Sheikh Hamza mentioned Ibn Arabi. That is actually Sheikh Hamza mentioned Qadi al-Bakr.
Yes, he always talks about Ibn al-Arabi. And without mentioning any details, some people think, oh, he loves Ibn Arabi. And that becomes like the biggest issue for them. And you know, because I say this because I have been at meetings and gatherings, and I've witnessed such cursing, and you know, I do my best to have a man's back, but you know, it is what it is. Alhamdulillah. 2 minutes. Any other questions? We're giving you a longer Q&A session tonight so that you guys are totally satisfied. Yes.
What you consider Ibn Taymiyyah, what mazhab he presented?
Well, Ibn Taymiyyah was both Hanbali and Maturidi, so he was still, you know, very close to what we talked about tonight. In fact, people who think that Ibn Taymiyyah was so unfavorable of Tasawwuf are wrong. If you go to the Fatawa, he actually talks quite favorably about the orthodox practices of Tasawwuf. So that was actually came as a surprise to me a few years ago when I did some research on that. But he's not Shafi'i and he was not Ash'ari.
Actually, Ibn Taymiyyah called, he was a Qadriya, and
They
they
say
called
that.
him
They say that.
Sayyidi. That's the word he used for him.
They actually say that he was involved in the Qadriya Tariqa himself. Of course, Hanbalis reject that narration out of hand. It is there. One last question. جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. العصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Now you can clap.